Hi, welcome. It's Sunday morning, and we are today fresh off the heels of the Judge Ehud, and moving on now. And things don't get any better here. We have a repeat of situations. It seems like a cyclical pattern, but let's dig into it because there's some interesting things today. We go to a number of characters, specifically Shamgar, in just that brief few verses about his role. And actually, his role, as it turns out, even though we don't have a lot of specifics, we don't even know if he's an Israelite. Takes on the Philistines, one of the most powerful of the enemies, and doesn't even use a real weapon. Grabs what it seems like is whatever is closest to him, and ends up defeating hundreds of the Philistine top warriors. Very interesting. And it says something, I think, about our God, too. The next character, of course, next judge is Deborah, a woman, which fits perfectly into what God is trying to communicate, and that is it's not about whom God chooses, it's about God and his plans. And then, of course, we move on to Gideon. And there are some specific things we can pull out of these accounts today that I think are helpful for us. First of all, as we look at Deborah in chapters 4 and 5, you really have in chapter 4 the historical account, which was probably written much later, even after Judges, the time of the Judges. And in chapter 5, we have this wonderful poem, this song, which probably was written on the heels of the victory. I almost picture a night in the tavern swinging mugs of ale and celebrating, but you put the two together and you get kind of this picture of really what happened. And as you look at chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, what happened was following Ehud, the Israelites' life deteriorated as they kind of went away from God. They ceased to use the roads for fear of the Canaanites. Again, they lived out in the countryside in the villages, and the Canaanites tended to populate the cities. There really was no village life at that point. In fact, in verse 8, we find out that when enemies come, they didn't even bother making weapons to fight. And we also find out, and we find out this is true in Gideon's case too with his own family, is they began to turn away and worship other gods. So it's a pretty bleak situation here. And then, of course, we have this account of Gideon, and in his life we see him secretly trying to, I believe it was working the olive press, trying to hide out from the Midianites who tended to take all of the produce and the gleanings from the fields, the harvest from the fields away from the Israelites. And we find out that as God comes to him, his dad is actually a priest of a Baal temple and has a shrine there to Baal. And so, we get these pictures. In the first case, the focus of the enemy is Sisera. In Deborah's case, a tyrant warrior. In Gideon's case, it's the Midianites who have come across, camped out. And it's interesting that in actually, if you add Shamgar into this picture now, in all situations, the one who brings the victory is God, and he does it in very unique ways to kind of help the people to understand that it is him who gives the victory and not them. In Shamgar's case, you got this one guy we know little or nothing about, and he uses an ox goad. Just kind of wields it as if it were a weapon. And then in Deborah's case, she has Barak, or Barak, who's supposedly she calls, who's going to be the warrior, and God gives him the calling and he's ready to go, but he's got some conditions before he heads out there, and in the end, it's not even he who really gives the victory, it's God, and God not only works to bring about his victory, but then he uses another woman to pound a tent peg through the skull of Sisera ultimately. So God works in very unique ways. And by the way, in those days, women were the ones who tended to put up the tents. That was considered women's work. And so she was, and I believe it was jail, she would have been very familiar with how to pound a tent peg into the ground. Then, as we move on in Gideon's case, we will find out in tomorrow's reading that God again will bring about the victory, and it won't be by might of arms of the Israelites. In fact, it's going to get whittled down to an army of about 300 to ultimately claim that victory. So we can see all of these interesting accounts back and forth, but there are several things that seem to flow through all of them. Number one, trusting and obeying God and not in other gods, other people, money, power, even ourselves seems to be the answer, seems to be what God points to over and over, and yet it seems to be a lesson that the Israelites just were not able to hang on to. And in many cases, I wonder today if that's not true for us too in our sinfulness. Another lesson that I see out of this is that if we do stray, it seems that sin always has with it some sort of negative consequence, many times painful. Even if we get away with it for a while, the reality is down the road, somewhere along the line, or even in the midst of it, it's not pleasant. We're fooling ourselves if we think it is. And the third thing I think that we find out is in these lessons is don't focus on the circumstance. Focus on God in the midst of the circumstance. And I like that because it seems always when we start weighing the circumstances, we can become defeated. We can be depressed and demoralized as they were in these cases. And God says, trust in me, not in you, not in what's going on around you, not in your armies or anything else. I will provide the victory. And isn't that true in our lives as well? And for God's church here on earth, that it is He who brings about the victory, as He did in His Son Jesus Christ on the cross, and in a very unique way from what we might have calculated or figured needed to be done. And that should give us reason to trust our God all the more each and every day. So, no matter what circumstances you're in the midst of today, I pray that you will trust in God, and He will bring victory in your life. God's blessings to you this day.